Good evening. Well, welcome from the Norman Williams Public Library. I'm Meg Brazil, and this evening we're here for a book launch with Julia Cooke and her new book, Come Fly With Me, the Jet Age Story of the Women of Pan Am. And it's a really, I think, quite unique story, and it's many stories mixed into one, as you'll hear. We've got a really full house tonight, people from all over Vermont and elsewhere. And today I heard of at least 3 Vermont stewardesses who flew with Pan Am in this era. So we're kind of hoping that they might pop us a question or two, but there's obviously going to be lots of questions. And I just want to say a couple of things before we get started. First, thanks so much for showing up. We have a full house, over 100 people. And we're also, I think, streaming live for the first time on Facebook. And we are using a webinar, so you won't see yourselves, and we'll be using the chat function. And Julia's got a lot of stuff to talk about. So I'm going to ask you to maybe hold your questions till a little bit later on. And then we'll try to get as many questions answered as we possibly can. Let's see, what else do I want to ask? Oh, I wanted to say, so I don't know if people know, but this is actually launch day. And so launch day is the day that the book actually arrives in the retail stores. So it's in our own Yankee Bookshop in Woodstock, and they accept online orders, in-person orders, and curbside pickup. And they're also, I forget what you call it, but it's like the bookstore of record, or the kind of official Come Fly With Me bookstore. But of course, you can also purchase the book at any independent bookstore, and also all the big places that sell books, which you all know about. Let's see, what else? Just in case you are disconnected, you can use the same link to get right back on. So let's go ahead, fasten your seatbelts, and please put your tray tables in their upright position and extinguish all cigarettes. And now, come fly the world. Over to you, Kathy and Julia.
Thanks, Meg. I'm Kathy Beaird of the Norman Williams Public Library, and welcome tonight to our exciting launch of Julia Cooke's wonderful book called Come Fly the World. And I have to say, Julia, I love this cover, and I'm pretty picky about covers, but this is just great. Julia is a journalist and a travel writer whose features and personal essays have been published in Time, Smithsonian, Condé Nast Traveler, and Saveur. She is also the author of The Other Side of Paradise, which is life in the new Cuba. The daughter of a former Pan Am executive, Cooke grew up in the Pan Am family. After meeting some vibrant Pan Am stewardesses, now in their 70s, she became really intrigued by their stories, and that interest culminated in the book, Come Fly the World. Today, as Meg said, is the first day of its publication, and we're so happy to have Julia here with us, even virtually. It's just great to have her no matter what, to celebrate the launch with her and discuss her book. Let me just add that I'm sure many people in the audience already know, Julia lives here in Woodstock with her family. Julia, before we open the book, could you just tell us how your upbringing as an airline kid helped you find your career as a journalist and writer, and also what brought you to Woodstock? Julia?
Yeah. Hi, first of all, thank you all so much for coming out. It's so fun to see some of your names pop up in the chat. So hi to people in Brooklyn and Portland and my editor in Boston. It's so nice to see all of you, or not see you, but see your names. So my dad worked for Pan Am until I was 9. And it's really interesting because it wasn't until, honestly, I started thinking about this book and meeting the other people who had been involved with Pan Am that I really realized the outsized influence that growing up in this airline family had on me. Basically, when I was a kid, my mom, who is a total traveler, would pack us for hot or cold and bring us to the airport, and we would go someplace. It was kind of every vacation, every long weekend, we were someplace that was not where I lived. And I think that upbringing really shaped me. I think it made me curious. It made me really accustomed to traveling and movement and people who weren't like me. It made me really interested in finding out what the stories were behind all the different places that I went to. And that's what I wound up doing for a career. So I lived in Latin America for 5 years, Mexico City for 4, and then in Havana for a year, which is where I researched my first book. And then I moved to New York. And from New York, I moved up here. My husband and I had bought a small house right in the village that we had thought that would, we would live partially in New York and partially up here. We would come up here to get away from the city. And we found ourselves not wanting to leave, basically. And I will say that actually the library was a huge part of the reason why I wanted to be here, because every time we came up to visit, I would go and visit I would buy books from the shelves out in front. And I found so many books that I loved. And I remember thinking, if this is a small town in Vermont where people read a public space, and Ben Okri and Christopher Isherwood and all of these incredible writers, then I want to live there. So we moved up here mostly so that I could focus on writing this book. It was really hard to get the mental space to work on it when I was in New York. I was teaching at the New School and writing for all those magazines, and I was not really getting very far on this book. And we moved up here, and I was able to focus more on it.
What did you teach at New School?
Writing. Yeah.
All right. So can you tell us a little bit about your writing process and how many years this took? I was so struck by the amount of research. I mean, you quote all of your sources and original sources. What is that word? Anyway.
Yeah.
But you have done so much research. So how long did that take you?
It took a really long time. All told, I think it was about it's almost exactly 7 years since I first met the women who really inspired me to start thinking about this book. At first, it was really stop and go, because I was teaching, I was writing other pieces. So I'm really grateful to a couple of the women who would get emails from me, and I would have an interview with them, and then they wouldn't hear from me for 5 months because I had to teach a semester and grade lots of papers and all of that. And then I would try to pick back up, and that kind of start and stop was not really getting me very far. But yeah.
So where were you when the pandemic struck us all? I mean, where were you with the book is what I mean. I keep thinking that the pandemic is certainly not the best time to launch a book. However, thinking about it more, it's a great time to launch this particular book, because we're all so hungry for new stories and taking us places that we've never been. And this book does exactly that.
It's such an interesting point. I mean, I could never have foreseen this, but you're right. I think armchair travel is a big thing right now. And when the pandemic hit, I was just finishing up not quite finishing up, but moving toward finishing up the edits on this manuscript. And I was really excited. I'd had a baby a year before, and I hadn't been traveling at all, because between baby and book, it was too much. And so I had all these plans last March. I was making plans for the summertime, and I was thrilled to travel more, and then nope. So yeah, I'm also excited to be doing armchair travel. So if people have suggestions for what I should be reading, tell me.
So when you say, or when we went back, or going back to that, you did a lot of writing for Smithsonian, and were those all, can you just discuss about what kinds of topics that you used to write for Smithsonian and Time?
Yeah, so I was a freelance writer, journalist. I would travel, find subjects that I found interesting. This is part of why I wanted to teach. After I lived in Mexico and Cuba, where I had been primarily a freelance journalist, I decided that I really wanted to try to teach. So I went back and got my MFA and taught, which was a really great place it was an awesome source of stability to move on from. It allowed me to really only write the articles and essays that I was really excited about. So I would go on a trip or meet some interesting people or go see, I've written a lot about art and architecture as well. So I would go see an exhibit that I really loved or find an artist that I was really excited about and just start to pursue it and interview around it. My habit is to really interview around different subjects and talk to different kinds of people and read around things, research a lot, and then kind of work my way toward the topic or the subject that I'm really excited about.
So we had a question about how you actually met these women that inspired you to write this, and then I'd like to know also, stories come your way all the time. I mean, what about these women or what about this story just really grabbed you and you said, okay, I'm going to spend the next 7 years of my life with this?
Well, I had no idea when I started it that it was going to be 7 years. I'm thrilled that I'm thrilled to have spent that amount of time with the women that I spent that time with. They're really engaging women, and that is the story of how I first met them at an event. Because of my dad's involvement with Pan Am, I knew about the Pan Am Historical Foundation, which is a really great resource, and anyone who's interested in more direct, less flight attendant or stewardess focused content should go and check them out. They hosted an event at the TWA flight terminal at JFK, which back then, 7 years ago, it hadn't yet become a hotel. And I'd really always wanted to see it. I love Eero Saarinen, and the flight center is just, it's a cathedral to flight and to modernism. It's beautiful. So I went and I met these two incredibly stylish, really vibrant, exciting women who were just, they were so impressive. They were, I think the way I put it in my mind, I thought about it as they really talked about history as if they'd had martinis with prime ministers and spies and rock stars and every kind of person. They spoke with such authority about both real nitty gritty historical, geopolitical happenings, and then also the more exciting and poppy things. They talked about shopping places, and then they talked about civil wars and the recent decolonization of different places in the 60s that they had experienced. So I was fascinated by them, and I really wanted to know more. And so I started going to more events and meeting more women. And then I wound up, I found the women who would eventually be the subjects of the book via World Wings International, which is the Association of Former Pan Am Flight Crew.
So did these women have any idea that the kind of, I call them point guards or something, they were sort of the beginning of a lot of this, I can do things, I don't have to be put in a box. Did they have any idea at the time that they were really vanguard,
I don't know. I don't, my instinct tells me that no. When I asked them why they started flying, almost to a woman, every single person said to me, because I wanted to see the world. They are an incredibly curious bunch of people who, I think that desire to get out into the world was much bigger than a kind of self-consciousness about, trying to change the world. I don't think they realized that in seeing the world, they were going to change it.
So so you're keeping in contact with them, obviously. Are they still as interested in the world and just as vibrant?
They really are. That was one of the other things that that really interested me about these women. It was really a selfish thing in a way that I was, when I was in my early 30s when I started doing this research, and I honestly, when I talked to them, they all seemed to have lived these really exciting lives, and they knew it. They were women in their 70s who still went on girlfriends trips together. They really invested a lot in their friendships. They seemed to have really done it. They seemed to have figured something out. And I, as a younger woman, honestly really wanted to find out how they'd done it.
So someone was saying in the chat that what is the connection between wanting to travel and actually ending up seeing or changing the world? Can you speak more about that? It's like at those in that time, you had 2 or 3 choices of the things that you were supposed to be when you were as a woman, and being free to do whatever you wanted to do was not really one of them.
Yeah, so in the early 60s, and I think it's really easy for women my age, especially and younger, to forget that in the early 60s, there were certain acceptable paths for women, as you say. The really accepted things were teacher, nurse, secretary, and stewardess. And so, so there are 2 ways in which these women contributed to really changing the world. One, on a more literal level, the lawsuits that they propelled through the court system in the late 60s and early 70s, based on the EEOC in 1964, set the precedent for labor law that women's rights organizations would rely on for many years to come. It really these were women who didn't, so in the 60s, and the book details all of this in much more detail, but when they started flying in the 60s, the airlines required these women to be under 26 at the age of hiring, and it required them to meet very, very stringent weight and height and beauty standards. And it required them to quit the job once they turned 35 or got married. So, all of that is incredibly sexist and really pretty horrible. And the airlines fought tooth and nail in some cases to keep those requirements in place in the face of women who really wanted to keep their jobs. And a lot of them didn't necessarily want to go to court over what we would now think of as the most egregious aspects of that of those requirements, like the physical or the beauty standards or the weight standards. They wanted to keep flying. So they didn't want to quit when they were 35. They didn't want to quit when they got married. And they went to court to change those rules. And so on a literal level, that's how they really changed the world that we live in right now. But I think also, and researching this book really convinced me that their desire to just get out there in so many numbers. They were crews of women who were traveling on their own. One of the women that is one of the main subjects of the book is named Karen, and she's really independent. She loves going places on her own. She wouldn't really often go to group parties. She just wanted to walk around. So I heard tons of stories about walking around Hong Kong and the habits that she liked to, she liked to go to one place for dim sum, and then she would walk along the streets and explore these markets and just travel through this neighborhood and walk around, and then go to the specific restaurant for dinner. And I heard multiply that times like 6 different cities that she told me about, and just multiply that by 25,000 women who form these flight crews that are all just exploring the world on their own or with other women. It was unprecedented before then.
Yeah. So as you well know, I lived through that era, woman of a certain age, and I just had to smile a lot at the section that you talk about the appearances and what was the guidelines, and they weren't the airline was not going to do anything about stretching that. It's just what it was. And
no, if you read, I mean, the book has some of this, but it has some really interesting little quotes from these like it's excruciating to read the way that they would assess women physically, and the lengths that the airlines went to try to keep these regulations in place, especially around age, and especially around keeping only women as stewardesses, to keep men from being flight crew. They put psychologists on the stand to testify as to why only a woman was capable of calming down a nervous passenger. And these it's a real time capsule to read about that.
Yeah, it certainly is. Brings back a lot of memories for me. Would you like to read some passages, and we can
Sure.
more questions or do more questions? But why don't you read some?
Yeah, I have I picked out a brief passage just from chapter 1, so right from the beginning, which kind of sets the scene of why and explains the desirability of the job. At the beginning of chapter 1, readers will meet a woman named Lynn, who's just finishing up her college degree at SUNY Oswego. She's finishing up studying science. She's had all these assistantships in labs, and she's getting bored of it. Honestly, she's realizing that being surrounded by being an assistant in a lab or a science teacher, which is really all she could count on doing as a woman graduating in the late 60s, who didn't necessarily want to get a PhD and climb a ladder that would take a really long time, or be the only woman in sight in many of these labs. She also then went to Rome. She's fresh off her first trip out of the country. And all of a sudden she has this new idea of a career that she wants to pursue. Working as a stewardess gave a woman the ability to see different places, and also to experience who she could be against those very backdrops. This invitation to try out an unfettered version of oneself somewhere else had appeared to enormous numbers of women from the start of the commercial airline industry. Sadie in New York read a 1936 profile in the Chicago Sunday Tribune of a stewardess who had beaten out hundreds of other women for a spot on the United Shuttle, is a very different person from Sadie in Chicago. In Chicago, Sadie Erickson, the profile said, lived a life of considerable dash, biking, swimming, roller skating, and shopping. But twice a week, her job took her to New York, and New York Sadie was a different sort of woman. As soon as she arrived there, she bought 2 books, one fiction, one nonfiction, and a supply of magazines. She stocked her hotel room with a pound of chocolates and a half a dozen apples, and she had her meals sent up as she read, stretched across the hotel bed in her dressing gown. A decade earlier, when air travel was raw and new, cabin attendants in the established model of train stewards had been men. But in 1930, a nurse and trained pilot approached an airline executive to convince him that nurses would make better cabin crew. The pitch worked. A nurse could more naturally reassure a fearful passenger, the executive wrote in a memo, or minister to airsick men. Quote, "The passengers relax," reported an Atlantic Monthly writer. "If a mere girl isn't worried, why should they be?" In the mid-1930s, a stewardess had dragged 2 passengers from the burning wreckage of a Pennsylvania crash that had killed 12. Though she was injured herself, she ran 4 miles for help. Front-page articles celebrated her as a heroine. Profiles of other women in their crews, friendships, and habits appeared across newspapers and magazines. "Air hostess finds life adventurous," read one front-page headline in the New York Times. Indeed, Sadie Erickson was a model of the duality expected of the stewardess. She had social skills and self-determination, glamour, and grit. The petite blonde looked like a captivating French doll, and was almost magically endowed by looks, temperament, and education to be outstanding in a profession that required poise and fearless capacity for action and grim courage. The next 2 decades consolidated the view of the job as women's work. During the Second World War, women took cabin positions across airlines as men served in the military. Passengers began to favor air travel over ocean or rail in the post-war 50s, due in part to technological advances such as a jet plane that sliced a trip across the Atlantic down to 6 or 10 hours, depending on whether there was tail or headwinds. Airlines competed for passengers by touting technical innovations, but only so many customizations to the new jet plane existed. Prices were stabilized by the government at $400 or $500 to cross the Atlantic, so flying was too expensive to be a regular undertaking for anyone but the rich. Each airline tried to convince consumers that it had the highest level of luxury and service, and the women who served a predominantly male clientele became a particular selling point. So then the book goes on to detail some of the glamorous ways that airlines tried to lure passengers, from couturiers who were designing the uniforms, the gold carpet that one airline rolled across the tarmac, and more. And it also details the contradictory danger of the moment. There was hijackings, and much more. And then it returns to the women. The point is that in the United States, the cabin of an international airplane was a sought-after workplace for young, unmarried, and mostly white women. Airlines in the early 1960s hired only 3 to 5% of applicants. Base pay was commensurate with other acceptably feminine roles: nurse, teacher, librarian, secretary. Perks included insurance, free air travel, paid vacation, and stipends on layovers. Layovers in themselves were extraordinary. A decade earlier, solitary international travel was rarely undertaken by a woman who could not leverage high social status to excuse her lack of chaperone. And most women had married long before their mid-20s. In the 1950s, only a third of American women were still single at age 24. Some years, more teenage girls walked down the aisle than attended the prom. The women applying for stewardess positions in the 1960s had, in the 1950s, been forbidden to wear pants in high school, and sometimes even in college. Now, during layovers, a stewardess could pull off the skirt of her uniform, put on slacks, and, chaperone-free, sashay around the museums of the 16th arrondissement. She could wear jeans and wander through Mexican markets. Flight routes, experience, and expertise varied by airline. But having a job on any plane was a reason for a woman to roam. What was revolutionary was the lack of should in this job, the plenitude of could.
I like that a lot. I liked how you taught you. I learned so much in this book. It's just incredible. So many things I didn't know, but one of the things I sort of focused on were the uniforms. When they first started out, they were kind of military looking in a way, and they were sort of professional and garnered respect, I would say. You know, they sort of looked a lot like the pilots. And then as time went on, as you say, you know, the designers came in, and all of a sudden they were wearing mini skirts and sheer things and stuff. I mean, I felt so, I don't know. I just, you know, I wondered about that just what a big arc. They went backwards, you know, in a way. You know, they started out looking very professional, and then.
Totally. Well, and you know, it's worth mentioning that on Pan Am, for the most part, on Pan Am, definitely on Pan Am, the uniforms really were consistently much more conservative than on the other airlines, because keep in mind that a flight on Pan Am could, you know, a round the world trip would land in places where the cultural revolution, the sexual revolution, was not happening. So, you know, it had to be pretty conservative, and a lot of the women that I talked to really appreciated that. They felt very dignified by uniforms that were stylish, and definitely, you know, they hired Don Loper and Edith Head to design the uniforms, so that they were beautifully tailored and stylish, fashionable, but not too racy. On the other airlines, certainly, it seemed to go really quickly from you know, military to pretty, you know, there were hot pants on a couple of airlines, and again, that it's really excruciating to read about the ways that women were expected to dress. But I also talked to a couple of women who thought it was really fun. You know, some women wanted to wear mini skirts. They enjoyed that. They enjoyed, you know, the freedom to dress how they wanted to dress. So it's worth considering that too.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this whole book just reminds me that all we ever wanted was to do and be how we wanted to be, whether that was wearing whatever we wanted to wear. I mean, I think that it's such a good point in this book about, they just were what they wanted to be. And, that was great. One of the other things that I was really struck with is that I had no idea what their roles were during the Vietnam War. Could you talk about that? Because that was incredible.
Yeah, so Pan Am, along with other airlines, Pan Am was not the only airline to contract with the US government to bring soldiers overseas. It's interesting because it had never occurred to me that civilian airlines were transporting our troops to war. But of course, the Pacific Ocean's huge, and we had at some point, I think, over 500,000 men in Vietnam. So they had to get there somehow. And the civilian or the commercial airlines were the best way to do it. So the U.S. government contracted with all these different American airline companies. Pan Am was one of them. It had the largest market share of those contracts. It also, from the very beginning, ran the R&R program. And they started it in 1966. And because Pan Am had been connected with so many other U.S. government missions in the past, it was very intertwined. Then the book details this as well, with the government in World War II and in other events. So because of that, Pan Am really wanted to make it very clear that they were involved in the Vietnam War. And they were really proud of it. So they ran this R&R program. In 1966, they asked 60 odd women to go live in Hong Kong to fly exclusively military contracts. That program ended in 68, and those women were dispersed to other bases. And at that point, and slightly before that as well, but women could be, from other bases, could be assigned to fly Vietnam War flights, primarily out of the West Coast. So, you weren't required to fly the flights. You were always allowed to opt out of it. But that would mean that you probably wouldn't be flying to Southeast Asia. And for a group of really, really curious women who were very determined to see everywhere, that was not a great bargain. So they said yes. So they wound up flying these really young men out to fight this war. And a lot of them had really different, I met women who had a huge gamut of responses to that. Some of them were really proud to contribute to a war effort that they believed in. Some of them were active participants in the anti-war efforts and really felt much more ambivalent about flying soldiers out to a war that they thought was wrong in every way. So, but even those women, I think I was really, what I found fascinating about their experiences was that the experience of flying the troops was such an intimate one, that they were with people, young men in these really vulnerable and deeply frightening moments. And it meant a lot to them to be able to offer a level of human dignity that they found really important, even if they were, with every fiber of their being, against the war itself.
Yeah, I think you do a really nice job of pointing that out, and talking about their attitudes or their willingness to go ahead. They're being shot at. I mean, they're going into Vietnam and they're being shot at, and maybe they don't agree with the war or whatever, but they're still just so kind and understanding and empathetic to the soldiers. My brother was actually on one of those when he went and flew on the R&R thing, and he said, the stewardesses were just great. I mean, here we are, we're just, a bunch of wild guys, but the stewardesses were wonderful. And as you say, and he repeated it, they gave us a sense of home, a sense of normality. And he can't say enough kind, words about how wonderful the experience was that stewardesses provide.
Yeah, it was so interesting. I went to DC for Veterans Day. At some point, I realized that I had spoken to all of these women about their experiences flying men into war. And, one thing to keep in mind, or that I had to keep in mind as I was writing this and researching it, was that this was a drafted war, that a lot of these men did not want to be there either. So that was worth thinking about. But anyway, halfway through my research, or toward the end of it, I realized that I had talked to so many women, and I had not talked to any soldiers. So I went down to DC and just stood around the Vietnam Women's Memorial and walked around the Vietnam Memorial and just walked up to men and asked them what they remembered about their flights in and out of Vietnam. And I heard some really interesting stories that a lot of them chime really well with what you're saying that your brother experienced.
And also, I mean, they're volunteering to do this, which is, amazing. But also, you talk about the baby lift as well, which must have been, an incredible experience for them to be part of that. Will you talk more about that?
Yeah. So in 1975, at the end of the war, for those of you who aren't familiar with this particular moment of history, there were a ton of orphans who were at Vietnamese orphanages, and some of them were actual orphans. Others were the children of refugees who had been left for safekeeping at orphanages, and some of them were the children of Vietnamese women and with American servicemen who had heard that the incoming North Vietnamese would murder all of their children. So they gave their children to the orphanages and hoped that they would make their way elsewhere. So in the face of all of this chaos, the Operation Baby Lift began, which was an operation to bring 2,000 orphans to the US. The first flight was run by the Air Force, and that plane crashed. And I think less than 24 hours later, a Pan Am flight went from Hong Kong to Saigon to bring back the survivors of that plane crash, which killed over half of the passengers, and more orphans. So now these were women who had thought they were on a regular around the world flight, and then their plane was their mandate was shifted, and they were asked to fly into Saigon. And these women I found really, really remarkable. No one knew in that moment whether or not the plane that had crashed the day before had crashed because of North Vietnamese sabotage, and they didn't know what had happened. And you've got these women who are seen as being these flighty stewardesses who are literally flying on a mission like that, and it gives me goosebumps.
And you've got some pictures. You've got some great pictures in here. You've picked a lot of fine pictures, but there are a couple in there too of the baby lift. Of the stewardesses of the babies. Kind of strapped in on the chairs, and somebody is filling bottles. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, I have some here that I brought. I was going to show some of the photos that one of the women who was one of the main characters, subjects of the book, Karen, wrote an article about the baby lift. And now, it's worth adding that the baby lift is a very complicated event. Not all of the children were orphans. The government really messed it up, and it kind of really resembled a kidnapping. So it's a really complicated piece of history, but to me the fact of the women were only told that children needed help, and it might be really dangerous, and they said yes. So that impulse to me is a pretty pure one, and that's what I found really interesting. But I lost track of what your question actually was, or if I answered it.
So I was just talking about the
photos.
You've just done a nice job of curating some really really special pictures, and I just once again, I just can't say enough about how much information this book holds, and And you do a really honorable job of, I mean, we're here in 2021, looking back at those things that happened in the 60s and 70s. And so our thoughts, our ideas and everything are different now. But you do an honorable job of presenting it all, because it was very complicated. And I just can't say enough about your book.
Thank you. So
do you have anything else that you want to read or show?
No, I was going to show. So I've gotten a lot of questions and interviews about my research process, and I thought that I would show a little bit of it. My instinct with this book was to really follow the oral history, the interviews of the women, in part because I felt like their experiences and what they had lived through hadn't really been seen from the angle that I was interested in seeing. And so I wanted their stories and what they told me to point me toward the research, rather than reading the books or going to the archives first and seeing what I thought was interesting and then asking them about that. So my approach was really to go back and forth between interviewing them and then going to the archives or going to newspapers and to confirm what they had told me. And I didn't want to put anything in the book that didn't come from both the mouth of a woman who was telling me about it, or and a news source, or that wasn't told to me by two or more women in the same way. I really wanted to be sure that, because this was all memory, that it was as close to completely verified as I could get it. So one of the ways that I did that also was I was able to get letters from two of my interview subjects. They sent me letters dating from all the letters that they had sent home from their parents from these different trips. So for Karen, I have letters from when she was working at a service club, an Army service club in Germany. I also have some amazing photos. This is Karen in her Army uniform. And Karen she's I like the one of her singing right there at the service club. And so I've got the letters and the photos, and the letters go through her honeymoon, which is a whole story. That's a big chapter of the book. She went on her honeymoon by herself for reasons that you'll have to read the book to find out. And these are, there she is. She crewed a square rigger in Tahiti, and then she also was on this baby lift flight. So these are her photos that I had, and she wound up writing. She's the one who loved to travel by herself and walk around these different places, and she would always bring a notebook and take notes. She really wanted to be a writer, and the baby lift offered her a way to do that. She wrote an article in the Sunday Missoulian about her experience on the baby lift flight. So yeah, it was really helpful for me to be able to see these letters and look through their snapshots and their photos, and see, especially in the letters, how they were thinking about what they were doing while they were doing it versus thinking about it now with all the years in between. It was interesting to jog their memories.
So it's such a great thing that the idea I think of a lot of people have of stewardesses, or they did then, was, do you remember that? Well, of course you remember the book called Come Fly Me, or what was it?
Coffee, Tea, or Me.
Coffee, Tea, or Me.
Yeah.
and then so that's how a lot of us, thought of stewardesses and stuff. And then it turns out
it was written by a man.
It was written by a man.
It was entirely a figment of the male fantasy imagination. It really is. It's so depressing that the way that, but it's also so apt, of course, that this book that wound up pigeonholing a whole huge group of incredibly adventurous, interesting women as just in it for the parties and the men, was written by a man.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've got the book to disprove all of that.
I hope so. God, I hope so.
Let's see. I don't know. Let me just check on some of these. There are a number of people are in the chat that flew Pan Am in the 80s. So it'd be fun, hopefully that they can have a way of getting a hold of you or something.
Yes, I was going to say that I'm hoping to do a social media campaign. I would love it if people can email me with great stories of the remarkable stewardesses or flight attendants that they know, and I'll share them all on social media. Send them along.
And would you tell people what?
Yeah, so they can find me on Twitter. I'm Julia C. Cooke, or on Instagram I'm also Julia C. Cooke, and on Facebook I'm author Julia Cooke.
Great. Apparently Karen Meyer is in the audience.
Karen Walker?
Oh, Karen Meyer? Am I? Oh,
this is a different Karen.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so.
But hi, Karen.
Because she apparently flew too, so I got that mixed up. Yeah. Okay. As I say, I just learned so much, and I think that this is a great book, and we talked earlier that this is Women History Month too, so
yeah,
it has really come out at the right time. Let me see if I can find any more questions, or you have anything else you want to read?
I don't have any. No, I'm. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But
okay, yeah. So they were talking about bidding on your flights, and you were awarded. Can you talk a little bit about that too, and then I'll make just how people were assigned flights and how that.
Yeah, so you had different levels of seniority, and one interesting thing. Well, I'll come back to that, but different levels of seniority, and you would bid on a monthly basis for what routes you wanted to fly, and sometimes you could not get them for lack of seniority. What was I going to say? Oh yes, on the different levels of seniority. It was one of the really interesting things to learn was that in the mid 60s, at the beginning of the 60s, the years worked for different airlines because of these rules around marriage and retiring in your 30s. Women didn't tend to work for any airline for very long, so no one really accrued seniority. But then over the course of the 60s, as the rules changed, the women stuck around longer, and the levels of seniority became very different, and their experiences of bidding flights then became very different. So it was harder to get the more coveted flight routes.
So Meg, do you have?
Well, I just thought I'd pop in for a minute. We've got a number of questions that you guys probably they've just scrolled right by you, but I did want to give a shout out, and maybe everybody who was a stewardess could just do a quick raise your hand if you know where to hit that on the button. I'm seeing 7 people, 8, 9, 11, 12 people, 13, 14 raising their hands who were stewardesses.
That's so cool.
They've been posting here. They were here these years and on Pan Am and all this stuff. 15. And I also got several emails from people whose, mothers, sisters, were also stewardesses during that era. So it's really cool. So another way I think, and Julia, you can confirm this, to reach Julia is on her website. I think there's a contact there. And it's fun to go there because, definitely you want to buy the book, but there's some great photos there as well. And I borrowed it from a friend, so I had to get it back to her before I finished it. So that's definitely happening. But I wanted to mention a couple things too that I think you and the audience will get a kick out of. Karen Meyer, who I had talked to earlier, she was actually on, and I may have this a little bit off, so my apologies, Karen. She was on the flight with the press and various White House attendants, and Richard Nixon was on Air Force One on that first trip to People's Republic of China.
Oh,
So,
wow. That is a historic flight to be on.
yes.
The press charters were really interesting.
Yeah. So she actually had a question. If you happen to know if anybody from that flight may have ever written about it, whether it was crew or if you've ever.
I don't know. Valerie Lester wrote a great book called Fasten Your Seatbelts that collects a lot of the most notable the stories from the really notable and interesting flights. But I couldn't answer that with any authority, but my instinct says that it hasn't been written about hugely.
Well, and she was saying she still has a full blue Pan Am uniform and blue bag and hat. She said, we had the military look to be respected if need be, in emergencies in particular. So I thought it was so interesting how it's kind of like, when it suited them, the women were like considered very professional and kind of equal to the crew. But then at other times, kind of not so much. And I'm certainly of that era, or sort of maybe the tail end a little bit. But I was the second girl to wear jeans in my high school, and it was like a riot broke out. And then Sherry Belial commented, that in that era, even the passengers dressed up.
Yeah.
But also like the 60s it was all about clothing and the look and the style. So it was fun.
Well, and it's worth adding that airline families still have to dress up. There was that whole flap a couple of years ago about the two young women that were kicked off of a United flight, or rather not allowed to board it because they were traveling on family passes and they were wearing leggings. Which, I gotta say, I don't have a problem with asking people to dress up for plane rides. I wish we all did a little more, although I really do like my comfortable pants too. So who knows?
And someone asked how involved, they said they loved the book cover, and were you involved at all in the cover development?
A little bit, yeah. We batted around some ideas, especially about what the sunglasses should reflect. We went through a couple of iterations of that.
Okay, so the sunglasses reflect. I don't know. Can you see it any better?
Yeah, I think it looks like Miami to me, but it's definitely a city on the ocean.
Yeah, it definitely is, because you can see the ocean out there.
Yeah.
And the back of it's fun too. I mean,
I know, I love her. I think she just looks so purposeful and authoritative. It's great.
Yeah. It was great. A lot of times authors don't get to have anything to say about their cover, so I'm glad you did, though, because this was great.
I have had an excellent experience with my publishing house and my editor, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to work with them.
I'm going to take a moment to do a pitch, and then maybe we'll just take one or two last questions. But someone asked if you're doing any book signings, and Carrie from the Yankee Bookshop said that if people buy books tonight, they get, I think 20% of it goes to the library. But don't let that, influence you. But I do hope you consider buying from Yankee. But the other thing is they have signed copies of the book, right?
Yes, I signed a whole bunch of copies of the book last weekend. So order from Yankee.
Yeah. So
and tonight.
That's a nice way to get them. And if not tonight, just get the book, because it's just such a great read. And we will have it at the library, but I think there's going to be a little bit of a waiting list, even if we get more than one copy. So a couple of people asked if they phrased it in different ways, but it was more or less, have you heard much about whether people felt that they were ever sexually harassed or became part of the Me Too movement later?
Yeah, I heard a couple of stories. There were a couple of women who declined to be interviewed, in part because they felt that it was a traumatic moment of their lives. There was one woman who told me about a moment of sexual harassment that sounds really horrible. And there was a lot more, casual sexual harassment. It was what in part propelled another angle of the airline or the lawsuits that happened in that era. I have a great quote in the book from a woman who in a moment they were trying to get the airline to give them the authority to not kick passengers off the plane, but to threaten them with being barred from the airline. And they made the really excellent point that beyond human dignity and respecting women's bodies as their own, it was in everyone's best interest that these women have some sort of viable consequence with which to threaten an aggressive or drunk or rude passenger with, because there was a limited number of crew on these planes, and if there were, say, 4 women on a plane and one of them is distracted because there's a grabby passenger in row 2 and she needs to try to contain him without offending him, all of her energy is going to go to that. She's not going to be looking out the window and noticing some malfunctioning equipment. She's not going to be looking for the hijacker in row 12 and figuring out what he's thinking about doing. She's not going to be able to do anything but try to contain this jerk. So really, they needed some sort of logical, viable consequence. So yeah, it was definitely a thing. I didn't hear about it. It wasn't like in every interview. And the women had experiences that they were telling me about that, but I did hear about it, certainly.
Yeah. Well, it's it's hard to know whether it's more prevalent now or more prevalent then, but it was so common. You just it was just like a fact of life. Obviously there's very serious episodes as well. So someone asked what your website is, and it's www.juliacooke.com.
Yes,
and you
that's it.
Find it all there. So 2 quick, well, not quick, but 2 last questions. Yeah.
Just to reiterate my point about this being such a good book, and while I'm of a certain age, so I remember a lot of this, I think you're absolutely right in writing this for people, young people, so they can understand what all happened and just learn from it. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Someone said just today on Quora, someone asked if I had ever been inappropriately touched on a flight. I told him that in the 80s, a man had grabbed my derriere in an attempt to get my attention for a new drink. I told him that I had basically karate chopped his arm and told him if he ever touched me again, I would have him arrested when we landed. The surrounding passengers all clapped.
Hell yeah.
I have a similar story, but I won't. That's close. That's close enough, and I wasn't a stewardess. So one question is, and it's a little after 8, so we'll wrap it up in a moment, because I know people probably have to get kids to bed and have dinner and all that. But was there a story that you loved that just didn't make it into the book?
There were so many. My editor can attest to the amount of words that we had to cut to make this to make the book make sense. But yeah, there definitely were. There was one story in particular about a woman who so the CEO, the founder of Pan Am, the legendary Juan Trippe, his son lived in Saigon and managed the Saigon base for some time in the mid 60s, right amid the troop buildup, and in between 66 and 67. And his wife got pregnant, and they decided that she should fly back to the US to give birth. So she needed to get out of the country at 7.5 months pregnant, and got to the airport, it was the air base, the Thompson Air Base, the military air base, and was boarding onto a Pan Am cargo plane, and under mortar fire. And the air base came under attack, and they barely got her out. And I asked her, I mean, my jaw was hitting the ground as she was telling me all this, and she was so nonchalant about it. And I said, what was that like? And she said, it just never occurred to me to be afraid. I was young and invincible. And that reflects so much of what I heard from so many remarkable women who were in circumstances that really are scary. And it just never occurred to them to be afraid.
Well, the other thing is, the book is sort of different than I expected. I mean, partially because I had read years ago the Coffee, Tea, or Me, whatever it was called, and there is some really intense episodes, but it's a really great sort of the vicarious, armchair travel, as you guys were saying earlier. And so, I mean, I certainly recommend it. Highly. And it just today, and I'm not sure I have this exactly right, but it just launched today, and it already has hit the top, let's see, I think it's like, maybe it's women history books. I'm not sure that's quite right.
That's great.
On Amazon and Apple Books. So it's going to be climbing, going to be out there. And Julie, I know this is like, everybody wants to know this, as do I, but I think it's one of the most difficult questions for an author when their book is, they've just spent 7 years. What are you working on next?
I am working on another book. I was working on it this past summer and fall. And it also has to do with the women who traveled a lot. That's all I really feel great saying, but yeah.
Well, great. I'm glad, because I know it can be really tough starting on the next thing after
it can be project. It really, yeah. I had a big blank after my last book came out, and I'm really grateful to have to already be working on something. It's really exciting to remember. This is a very specific phase of publication when a book heads out into the world. It's it's really exciting, but it's also not writing. So it's fun to be writing also.
Yeah, it's a lot of work and time kind of spent publicly instead of privately.
Yeah.
We have a lot on now.
Yeah, I could ask you questions all night, but I know we've got to get going. There was one thing I was going to say, I forget what it was. Well, I'm going to let Kathy actually have the last word if you want to. And we do want to thank all of our audience, all of these amazing stewardesses, both on the, here tonight, and of course in the book, and Julia for all her wonderful work. And normally we would never get to have a book launch if there weren't a pandemic, because she'd be at a bookstore. So we feel really lucky to be able to do this, and hopefully we'll get to do it again. But Carrie at Yankee Books has promised that we're going to have a party one of these days. So
I look forward to it. And thank you so much for hosting this.
Oh, of course.
Well, we're just, so excited and feel so honored, Julia, that we got to do this. And as I said, I already said this actually, but you just taught me so much about things I didn't know. And you just helped us put words to, as I say, the paving the way that we all just wanted to live our lives the way we wanted to live them. And that's what you're talking about here. It's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you around the library.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.